So as soon as you say something, you'll be the active speaker.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to be speaking to you this afternoon from the home of Dr. Rocco Martino, who is the presenter of this afternoon's seminar. So Dr. Martino graduated from UTIUS with his PhD in 1956 and completed his work on the first computer that U of T ever purchased, which was in 1952. He wore roller skates to travel from one end of the above-mentioned computer to the other, which makes him one of the pioneers of parallel processing. He worked for Sir Robert Watson-Watt, the inventor of radar. He directed all activities in Canada for UNIVAC and worked with Admiral Grace Hopper on automatic programming systems. He formed a partnership to create Mauchly Associates with Dr. John Mauchly, the inventor of ENIAC, and spearheaded the critical path method created by his company. He is the founder of XRT Incorporated, which developed the first fail-safe software for short-term promissory notes that allowed the moving of currency instantaneously to anywhere in the world, and therefore took the financial industry by storm. He invented the first smartphone called Cyberphone, and in 1995 filed the first of 7 smartphone patents that have since been cited in patents owned by IBM, Cisco, Hitachi, Siemens, NEC, and in 437 other patents issued or pending in the United States. He digitized the Vatican Library. So Dr. Martino has won a number of honors throughout his career. He is a Knight Grand Cross of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre. He was knighted by Pope St. John Paul II as a Knight of St. Gregory. He is a Knight in obedience of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. He was granted a personal coat of arms in 2003 by the Government of Canada. And last and not least, he is a member of the Wall of Distinction of the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering at the University of Toronto. So without any ado, I present to you Dr. Rocco Martino.
Well, thank you, Chris. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to come to the seminar this afternoon in the hope that I maybe will be lucid and brilliant. I expect to be complex and hopefully understood. Anyway, this afternoon we're going to talk about the technology tsunami and its impact on spaceflight. What do we mean by the technology tsunami? I think all of you know what a tsunami is. This is a unique point in the history of the human race, the history of humanity. There are certain key points in history where things happen, where they accumulate. I lived through one of them, the period immediately after the Second World War, because we went through a depression, terrible depression in the 30s, followed by the Second World War. So when all of that ended, there was an exuberance and a tremendous tsunami in terms of the development and the application of many of the techniques that were developed during the war. Am I not coming in clear? Okay. The technology tsunami is something that is applied indirectly through entrepreneurship, innovation, and invention. And to give you some idea as to the change and the tremendous change now in this period, and that will affect you, is the significant number of initial public offerings, IPOs. And there are many companies coming to the market and developing and raising vast amounts of money. This has never happened before in history. We had a significant drive of this nature back in 59, another one in 69, but not like this. You had to have a profit before you got some money. Nobody makes any money today, and they get all kinds of money. For instance, Lyft just went public. This was the taxi company. I think they raised $1 billion. They aren't profitable. They've lost $500 million. I don't know how they're raising it, but that's what's happening. So in this environment today, it's products that count, it's technology, and the application of these techniques to all of these different businesses. So let's start defining, and this is the only technology in the sense I'm going to do this afternoon. The rest of it I'm going to tell you how this is applied. But for now, what is entrepreneurship? Well, it means starting and controlling something, starting a new company. Okay, so you start a new company. What's the objective? What is needed to get there? Are there phased goals, or is it just open and shut? Minimum resources to get started, milestone measurements, modification of the plan and schedule, and your race in the hole. When I started Mockley Associates and brought it to Canada in 1959, I had a technique, and that was my ace in the hole. And I had a write-up in Business Week. What was the objective? To start a business, to get a contract. How was I going to do that? How was I going to do that? Nobody had ever heard of us. Like, I rented a Flexowriter typewriter, that's all we had in '59, and created a bunch of personal letters and sent them to the presidents of the major companies in Canada. That led to 3 contracts. That's how we got started. This is entrepreneurship. Innovation. Define the problem you wish to address. This is more important. Define the problem you have to solve. A lot of people solve the wrong problem. What is your solution to your problem? Does it solve the real problem? What resources are needed to achieve success? What are your risk factors and success factors? Now let's take a look at that. Your problem is you are trying to move goods from one place to another, and you had square things that you had as what we'll call wheels, and you were going on a very bumpy ride. Now, how are you going to make it smoother? You cut the ends off and you make it circular, and all of a sudden you got a wheel. Simple, isn't it? Fire. How do we create heat? How do we create fire? Well, there are many ways you create fire. You get flint, you bang it against stone, and it creates a spark, and you get fire. And the abacus. The initial arithmetic was done using hands and fingers and toes. And then we moved it to little pieces that we put on a string, and that developed the abacus. So you see how you can take a problem and something you want to do and get it going. Now it's 1943, and the United States Army wants a method of creating artillery trajections more accurately and faster. So they gave a contract for $250,000 to two professors at the University of Pennsylvania, John Presper Eckert and John Mockley. And they created a machine that, in the words of the inventors, was the biggest tube testing rack in the world. ENIAC had 18,000 tubes, and it went high or low. And that created binary capability, and they used that to start developing the circuits and the programs that allowed it to do calculations. How good was it? It was announced to the world on February 14th in 1946 and kept going for another 10 years, creating usable, needed computation capability. For a long time, it was the only computer in the world. We got one of the first computers in the world at Toronto in 1952. We called it Ferret. was developed by Ferranti Electric after they attended a seminar at the University of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1946, and went back to England and created the Ferranti machines, and then UNIVAC. These were the very first machines. And at Toronto, we had the Ferranti machine, fully programmable electronic computer in 1952. And that was probably in its time at the fourth or fifth computer in the world. And that's why at Toronto we had such a lead in this field for so many years. A gal called Grace Hopper, who was at that time a commander in the American Navy, went to work for John Mockley at Mockley Corporation, and her dream was to have the computer program itself. Computer programming was very complex in those days. You had to know the location of every memory spot where you want to get something or put something, and then the commands themselves were very complex. Grace developed a means of doing this using the English language and using alphabetic algebraic notation, the forerunners of COBOL and Fortran. Grace is very famous. Grace has a building named after her now at the U.S. Naval Academy. I was fortunate early days. I worked closely with Grace Hopper for many years. Grace was quite a gal, and if we have time, I'll tell you some stories that may put a different light on the fame of this remarkable lady. At Mockley Associates, we developed the critical path method, which swept the world in 2 years. It's possible to do something very fast. What did it solve? It solved the necessity to plan and schedule in such a way as to minimize the use of resources. It worked. In 1959, at the University of Waterloo, I gave the first courses ever given in artificial intelligence. And since then, there's been a lot of hoopla. But let me tell you right from the horse's mouth, what is artificial intelligence? It is the ability to know something and to be able to program it. There is nothing artificial about it. What it means is that you've transferred your ability to do the calculation to a machine which will do it. That's artificial intelligence. We go along in terms of ideas, examples of innovation. In 1995, May 19th of 1995, I filed for a patent on a combined telephone, computer, and I put a camera in it. And that was the smartphone. I called it the cyberphone. I was smart enough to invent the smartphone, but I wasn't smart enough to give it the name that would make it run. I called it the cyberphone. And some of the major corporations that have done well with their smartphones have said, well, they copied everything else from the patent. They might as well have copied the name. So that's just a little bit of personal history. The future will really go along with two important developments, augmented reality and virtual reality. Virtual reality is, for example, creating a program that lets you walk through a house that doesn't exist. Augmented reality would allow you to go to a meeting where everybody's coming in from different parts of the world, but you look like you're sitting around the same table. That is going to become extremely important. Another one that is becoming more and more important is 3D printing. 3D printing came along in 1984, and it wasn't until 2004 or 5 that it started to get realistically used. And then it was used for prototypes. because you would want to build one of a kind. Let me startle you a little bit by telling you that in India today, right now, they are 3D printing 600 square foot houses in a day. And in Russia, they are 3D printing 3-story high apartment complexes with multiple units, everything in it. That's 3D printing. 3D printing is a very practical, disruptive technology that is going to sweep things. Let me give you some other ideas of innovation. In 1962, I became the Chief Information Officer for Olin Matheson, and we had a number of divisions, one of which was Squibb. We made toothpaste. So one of the things I did was I went around to visit all of the different plants. I walked into the main plant in Brooklyn, and I saw this big bag hanging from the ceiling, dripping water. And I said, "What the hell is that?" And they said, "We're making toothpaste." And I said, "What?" And they said, "Yeah, when Dr. Squibb invented toothpaste in 1862, he got milk of magnesia and put some alum in it and some flavoring and stirred it and then drained off the water and he had toothpaste." And I said, "Well, this is 1962. Why don't you get some magnesium sulfate, add the pumice, add the flavor, put a little water, stir, and put it in a tube?" And that's how I came to realize that it becomes very important to ask the right question. What is the question? You don't want to, the question is not that how do I drain the water? The question is, how do I make toothpaste? Don't have to drain the water if I don't put it in. Now let's take another case. I was approached by the aluminum people with a proposal for $125 million. Remember, this is 1962, and $125 million was a lot more in terms of purchasing power than it is today. And that was to build a third soaking furnace. They already had two. What's a soaking furnace? This is something where you put ingots and you heat them up so then you can roll them. And they have a capacity of 4 ingots. And I said, "You want to build a third one?" "Yeah, why?" "Because we can't get all our ingots heated in terms of we're holding up the rolling mill." I said, "What? What's your average capacity? What's your average population in the 2 furnaces you have?" And he said, "Well, first of all," I said, "what do they hold? Their capacity is 4. And what's your average capacity?" 2.5. I said, "What? If you're only getting 2.5 in the 2 that you have, what do you want to build a third one for?" And then I asked another question. I said, "Does it matter how long you leave an alloy in the soaking furnace?" And the answer is no. I said, "Well, why don't you put 4 ingots in every soaking furnace and just heat them up until you start taking them out?" That saved $125 million. What is the question? Ask the question. What are you trying to do? We had, let me give you one quickie now, product mix. And that's a sort of a standard now in operations research. The product that has the highest profit isn't necessarily the best thing to make. And when we studied our aluminum operations, it turned out that the best thing we could do was to cut out the products with the highest profit and to keep grinding out the other stuff. And that made more money. So it's a product mix. What is the optimum product mix? And you do this so mathematically. That's how you ask and answer the right question. Now we come to electronic data processing. This is what we called everything back in the 50s. Then we changed it. Why are we manufacturing all this data? Why are we processing it? And the answer came back, because we want to build management information systems. All right. How are you going to do that with the way you're doing it now? And the answer was, oop. So we have to go back and start figuring, how do you start creating management information instead of just processing data? This led to the idea that we want to create control systems and global systems, and then handheld control. Handheld control. Why do you need this big machine that's the size of a big airplane hangar just to run a simple program? So this is how a lot of the innovation and the approaches are important. What do I want to leave with you? Is that how did I'm pushing the wrong button. How do I go forward? What there? Yeah, next. Over there. Thank you. You must pardon me, you know, old codger trying to play with new toys. Let me give you some idea of some of the products that have gone beyond innovation and have changed the world. The printing press of Gutenberg, 1440. The steam engine, 1776. The automobile, 1985. The airplane, 1903. The jet engine, 1941. A very interesting story. The jet engine was invented by Frank Whipple. He lost the patents because he didn't have enough money to pay for their renewal license fees. Another guy that Rudolph Diesel died penniless and broke. So inventors don't necessarily do well. It's the big companies that eat their breakfast. Antibiotics came out in 1944, the computer in 1946, the transistor in 1947, solar panels 54, but they're really only coming into their own now. Satellites, Sputnik was October of 1957. That was tremendous. I gawked like a little boy looking up at the sky, looking for Sputnik as I walked around some of the fields around in Westchester County in New York. I knew something new would come. Something new was coming. Global communications were the next step with the launch of satellites so that you could make long distance calls. But it's the internet that gave that importance. I used the forerunner of the internet in the 80s and 90s, but it wasn't as easy until we got the World Wide Web in the 90s. Then I did the cyberphone, which was the first smartphone. And as I said to people, I'm putting the world in your hands. And then I got hit by the disaster of 2000. You may have heard about that, the dot-com disaster. You couldn't sell anything that was technical until about 2005. Everything went kibosh. And that's when I was trying to come out with my cyberphone. Anyway, such is life. Social media was started in 97. And in 2009, we got the modern electric car driving with battery power. 2016, the self-driving car. So what's next? What is your invention? Okay. So from 2017 onwards, We have a culmination of advances in research. What are we going to have now? We're going to have robots as workers and companions. We're going to have inexpensive satellites, really inexpensive. Not only that, we're going to have satellites that are going to be maneuverable. This will lead to inexpensive global communication networks, major medical advances, cures of major diseases, longevity. These I put into a book that I wrote about 2 years ago called The Coming Technology Tsunami. I'm ready to do a review or an upgrade of that. Artificial intelligence and expert systems are going to have a major impact. Widespread, effective, and notice I put in the adjective effective education and retraining systems. Sometime next year, we will connect the entire world. That means we will have another 3 to 4 billion people that have to be trained in some of these technical systems. How are you going to do it? How are you going to do it within the time frame that's needed? There are robotic systems that are being developed, but that alone won't do it. Just think about it. You need a combination of people, very expert people, and expert systems in order to affect the education that's going to be needed. Augmented reality and virtual reality will lead to improvements in speed of prototyping and testing. And now we're going to get to the real gist of what I wanted to talk about today. I did it again. Oh dear. All right. We're all in the space business, right? We want to create practical means of space travel. What's the problem? Define it. Define the problem. Who wants to define it for me? What's the problem in spaceflight? All right, I'll tell you, it's fuel. It's fuel and travel time. So to make it effective, what do you want to do? You want to eliminate the need for fuel. And you want to cut down the time of going anywhere through continuous thrust. Because what we do now is we blast off, and then we shut down the engines and we coast until we're captured by the gravity of our target, and that finishes the flight. So there is no continuous thrust throughout. If there were, we get there a lot faster. So design a system using that solution. No fuel, continuous thrust. So if you do that, you can't have these 65-story high things that you fill with explosive and then put a match to them and they take off. So you go for space station launch instead of what we do now. So what is the impact of that solution on the real problem? So we start getting to a practical assessment of this solution. And we can come up with a test program. And on a broad scale, we do this with satellites, instruments such as the Hubble space and the replacement, the Webb telescope, manned flight, and space stations. One of the things we're talking about is creating a very large space station on the moon. Since we've now discovered that there's ice on the moon, we know that there's a potential source of oxygen. We have to see how much we have. All of a sudden, the moon becomes a rather important space station. And manned flight may make use of the fact that it is there. The Hubble telescope was a tremendous development, but it requires fuel. And now that it's run out of fuel, it's dead in space. Dead in space. So we're going to build a Webb telescope. And when it runs out of fuel, it'll be dead in space and we'll have to build another one. So what I'm saying is, why can't we build telescopes that do not require fuel to be carried? And there is two important things that have been developed, and you can read about them. One is plasma propulsion, and the other is solar sailing. You can have an arc discharge in outer space because you already have a quasi-vacuum. It's not a total vacuum, it's quasi-vacuum. But depends on the altitude. You run out of fuel even in outer space. The number of molecules, and if you use ambient nitrogen, the number of nitrogen molecules at 3,000 miles is pretty small compared to the number that you have at 100 miles. So why should that stop you? What would you do to get around that problem? Think about it for a minute. If what I need is more nitrogen that I have at 100 miles that I don't have at 3,000 miles or 300,000 miles, how do I get that? Well, I get myself a satellite that goes back and forth like a tanker. It goes down and charges up cylinders with nitrogen molecules and takes them up and turns them over to wherever I am, and I now have fuel. Think about that. Simplistic solution, isn't it? You think it'll work? Damn right it'll work. Solar sailing. You can use your solar panels to sail by picking up the energy flow that comes from the sun. So you can use your solar panels as sails. You can use solar panel navigation. So that now we have plasma propulsion and solar sailing. So there's really no need to blast off or gravitational coasting. Take off like an aircraft with a small amount of fuel, then turn on a ramjet, a small amount of fuel, takes you up to space station docks where refueling is needed. And then you have a plasma propulsion launch to anywhere with space station launch. You have a potential for a scheduled trip. Shorter duration space travel. A universal means of providing thrust, guidance, and navigation. These are your satellites and manned spaceships. The cube satellites that we have, and there are significant launches have taken place, but just wait till you see what happens next year. We have cluster launches because we have differential drag for placement and for the use of torque. So there's a company called Precise by Dr. Jimmy Turfel, Technion, Israel Institute of Technology. There's another company, Spire Global Inc., a space-to-cloud analytics company, uses nanosatellites to track aviation and weather patterns. Spire successfully deployed more than 80 Earth observation CubeSats into low Earth orbit and maintains a ground station network across 35 locations around the world. What is most significant is that all of those satellites were launched in a cluster, and they found their own location through using differential drag and through solar sailing. The same thing with Planet Labs. They do CubeSat miniature satellites called doves that then deliver in orbit as secondary payloads to other rocket launches. This combination of differential drag and solar sail has really created quite a capability, quite an impact. Let me give you some examples. China is now seriously involved in the space program. Most recently, they landed a device, a rocket, on the other side of the moon. It's quite significant. We've never done that. Multinational consortia are coming together to create space programs. However, some of the major developments are going to come from big tech. You undoubtedly have heard of Elon Musk and SpaceX. If you haven't heard of Elon Musk, you'll be quite prepared to tell you anytime how important he is to the space program. And he'll tell you how important he is to so many other programs. He's the man that's behind the Tesla motor car, and he's managed to lose $1.5 billion in 3 years. He hasn't made a profit yet, hasn't made a cent profit, produced a nice car. Let's see what he does in space. Well, he's done an important thing in space. He's developed a way of recouping the first the first stage, and he can recover the first stage of a blast off on a barge. And recently he really showed off. He recovered 3 first stages at the same time, 2 of them on barges and 1 back on its own pedestal standing up. When I saw it, I said, so what? That's the wrong question. The question he should have approached was not how to land a first stage and recover it, but why do you need it? Really, why do you need a first stage? Think about it. Just think of the impact of eliminating the first stage in all of our rocket programs. One guy who is working on that is somebody called Jeff Bezos. His company is Blue Origin. He has another company you may have heard of called Amazon. And he's going to be a force to be reckoned with because he's a very intelligent man. And he knows how to develop a profit. So he's not going to be involved in something that won't return a profit. Google is another one. Google is doing rather well in terms of its projected space program. And it's doing this in cooperation with Microsoft and a number of other major companies. Some creative thinking, I think, has to be applied to the space program. Let me give you some example. One of the things that you're going to need is a continual source of power if you're going to use plasma propulsion, where you have the creation of ion streams, which come from a continuous or continuing cycle of electronic discharge. Granted that you can use space sails and solar power, but it's not enough. Certainly not enough. Radioactive power is the ultimate requirement. I don't know if you know that the early satellites that the Russians put up were to a large extent dependent upon nuclear power. I was in Russia in the year 2000, and I was there as a guest of the president, Eugenio Fedorov, president of the Kurchatov Institute. The Kurtatov Institute is Russia's combination of MIT, Los Alamos. And that was really the location of the first Russian nuclear reactor. And in the year 2000, I walked through the earthworks of that reactor and had described to me in great pride how important that reactor had been in the entire Russian nuclear program. Eugenio was quite a guy. He had a couple of problems that he and I worked on. One of his problems was how to get power across Siberia, how to get Wi-Fi across Siberia. You can't imagine how many satellites you'd need, and this was 2000. It's not now. Problem solved now. What the satellites were going to put up, but at that time we didn't know how to do it. So out of the blue, we both seemed to think of the same thing at the same time. Barrage balloons. Why can't you put up a barrage balloon and use that as a transmission station, and at least within the confines of that space that you have, that you create, you've got Wi-Fi. We did it. That was one thing. Another thing is, I told Eugenio that I thought we had to have compact reactors, and he laughed his head off. Laughed. And he called up the co-director, assistant director of the labs, and I can't remember his name, but he was an admiral in the Russian Navy. He brings in this thing the size of a football. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a reactor." Think about it. Size of a football. A reactor. Full bore. That was 2000. Think of what they have now. And that's where the future of space flight is going. It's going to reactors the size of footballs. It's going to streams of ions being used for propulsion, and shuttles. It's going for the ability to tank up and have fuel tankers and deliver vast numbers of nitrogen molecules that you can then dissociate and create your ion streams. Imagination, think about it. No, don't be stalled by old nostrums. Who cares if you have to bring back the first stage into a barge? As long as you're going to use first stages, it's important. The question is, why use first stages? Let me give you an example of how to use some of these ideas, some things that you might create, your own invention, your own smartphone. Here's the problem. The Hubble telescope is a perfectly good telescope. It produced well for us as long as it had fuel. It has now run out of fuel. So it is now in, I understand it's in sort of a free fall into the sun. All right, what do you do? Solve it. You tell me how to solve that problem. Anybody got an answer? All right. Well, first of all, you can get some small satellites, and you can get them heading towards the telescope and have them attached to the telescope like rattle pods around the two perimeters. So by using the power in these rattle pods, you can flip the telescope. So instead of going towards the sun, it goes away from the sun. Then you can turn the power on and get it blasting coming back. How's that? How's that? So this is almost a cowboy technique. So you can lasso the Hubble idea. So worth pursuing? I think so. I think so. If I had anything to do about it, I would. So here's what I've been telling you since we started. It's a new world. We have all kinds of new tools. We have instantaneous communication that's only going to improve. We're coming up with a mod 5. It'll increase the speed of Wi-Fi significantly. We have satellites that are CubeSats, but we can still make big ones. But you don't have to make them that big. You can have a whole flight of these things. How many satellites, CubeSats, do you think Amazon is going to launch next year? And why are they going to launch them? Because it'll give them communication capability. And right now, the biggest provider of communication capability is Amazon. Amazon Wireless Systems. And that's only with regard to this part of the globe that's connected. What if Amazon takes on the connection of the entire world and owns that network? They talk about Bezos, who's now worth 180 billion, as being the potential first trillionaire. I think he'll be a multiple trillionaire if he achieves that capability. Google is not far behind. So this is how I see the world changing. I started off by giving you some truisms, and you may have nodded, saying to yourself, where the hell is he going? I talked about innovation. I talked about entrepreneurship. I talked about invention. And I gave you definitions. But the definitions were not what was important. What was important is what I talked about as examples of what we're doing. Same as Eugenio and I sitting down over a map and scratching our heads and saying, how are we going to connect these vast distances? We knew about satellites, but we couldn't we couldn't put up 100 satellites in 2000. We can now, not then. That's what it's all about. That's what this talk today is all about. Look at the definitions, but go past the definitions into what you have to do, because the definition of entrepreneurship, innovation, and invention is not what's important. What's important is when you ask the questions, what are you trying to do? What do you want to do here? Well, what do you want to do in space? You want to get from point X to point Y. Well, start thinking about that. How are you going to do that? Are you going to coast? Are you going to have continuous propulsion? how. That's what makes the entire concept of space so interesting. So interesting. It's no longer a case of who has the biggest bucks. Right now, it's a case of who's got the biggest ideas and the wherewithal to use and make those ideas come to fruition. I've just noticed I've got 4 o'clock on my wristwatch. Let me tell you how time is important, and I learned this when I was getting my doctorate. I was told when I got up to the Senate oral that, make sure that you stick to 30 minutes religiously. Otherwise, you will be criticized, if not penalized. In fact, one guy that one of my classmates got a little snotty, and when he was told he was running long, he said, "So what?" Well, they told him to come back in 6 months. Well, I was whizzing along and doing well and thought I was really covering the ground. And I looked at my wristwatch. 29 minutes were gone of my 30. I was 1/3 of the way through. So what did I do? Hey, Rock, solve the problem. What's the problem? Don't go over 30 minutes. Good. I put the chalk down and sat down. So it's 4 o'clock. I'm on time. So I promised that I would answer questions. So that's on your time, fellas and girls. So I will stay here and answer questions as long as you want. But remember, I didn't run over time.
Anybody have any questions?
All right. Well, question one.
Any questions, anybody?
I can't hear.
Can we get the Grace Hopper story? Open.
Rocco, one of our PhD students, Daniel Kepler, is asking if you can tell the Grace Hopper story.
I heard one of your PhD students went. Did you get that, Chris? Oh, you want me to tell the Grace Hopper story? Which one?
The most interesting one.
Grace always sat she sat in front of a design board. She never did have a desk. She had one of these design boards, and she always had her nanostick. And I always saw her with this wire. I said, "Grace, what the hell is that?" She says, "My nanostick." I said, "What do you mean nanostick?" She said, "It's 1 nanosecond of the distance from the equator to the moon, to the pool." And I said, "Isn't that a metric yard?" She said, "Yeah, but nobody would look at it, but I call it a nanostick." That was Grace. Grace Hopper worked for John Mauchly in the company called Eckert Mauchly. And Grace wanted a file cabinet. And they didn't have the money to buy her one. So one morning, John came to work and all his files were on the floor, and Grace had taken one of his files. Nothing stopped Grace. I mean, when I spent 4 years in the Pentagon, and Grace had an office on the 5th floor, and I used to go up there, and we used to kibitz every once in a while. But this was Grace, and one day I went up there and I said, I got a real problem. So she said, "What's it?" And I said, "Da da 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 da." I said, "Oh, that's easy. Just do this, this, this." And I broke every rule in the book and got away with it. That was Grace. Nothing stopped her. Nothing. If she had an objective, she achieved it. And she didn't let her, the sort of standard thinking stop her. And that's Grace. That was also John Mauchly. John was one of the most disorganized guys you ever want to bump into. Smart, oh man. But I miss them. I miss them. Anyway, next question.
Any other questions? I think
Rocco, we're going to wrap up now, but we want to thank you very, very much for taking the time and sharing all these thoughts with our students. So thank you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Believe me, it's going home for me. So thank you.
Well, it was nice to have you at UTIUS again.
Okay.
Thanks to technology. Yeah. Okay.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
You on board. Well, how was it?